Is it? Did it disconnect me? It did. This is like typical Google, isn't it? Like you spend it's a 30-minute meeting and you spend 28 minutes futzing around with Hangouts. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, how great is it that I come up here and I don't even have to make a pitch? What the?
Sorry, guys. I will not touch it again. I just maxed the screen out here.
Oh, so I need to do this again? Frickin' Google. Yeah, really? Like with a chef recipe? All right, so if I
All right, I'm not touching it. Oh no!
if I make it full, if I hit play on the, it like kills it.
You can't go full screen. You just did it.
I know, but he was using Google Docs. So if you're in within the if you're within the Google ecosystem, then you're okay. But evidently, since I'm using a competing presentation software product, Larry has no. This is great, dude. It's like this is a comedy club. Okay. There is no. I'm not using a. That's not my browser. It's his browser. Now my present. Anyway. Oh, yeah. All right. By the way, how great is it that I come up here and I don't even have to make a pitch for jobs at Chef? Somebody else makes a pitch for me, right? Wouldn't you all love for that to happen? So yeah, we are hiring folks to work on partner engineering, which is what Craig was talking about. But also we're hiring software developers and consultants, and it's a really quickly growing company. So there's a lot of different jobs, and as you can see, until this week I worked in services. So I was a senior consulting engineer at Chef, and now I'm leading a new team at Chef that's building additional products, including maybe some Docker stuff. So it's exciting times. So who I am, I'm a system administrator. Spent most of my time in operations, in big companies, small companies, ad agencies, broadcasting, all kinds of different fields. I'm also a reformed Java software developer, so I'm sorry for all the Java code that I ever inflicted on people in the world. It should just, I can just burn it with fire. And I also write stupid code like this Chef Doge formatter. So hey, if you want your Chef runs to have Shibu, and by the way, you can't really see this, but it'll actually randomly pick Doge words and inject them into your Chef output. There's a URL for it, so yeah. Right, today. Okay, so my presentation's entitled What Makes a Good Cookbook. So let's talk about cookbooks in general. Like we tell you, by the way, who is sort of a beginner at Chef, has not maybe touched Chef before? What about sort of intermediate level Chef folks? Advanced folks have been using Chef for a while. Okay, so we got a good mix, probably like thirdsies or so. So this presentation's kind of, I should preface it by saying that some of the code examples and things that I show in here may be aimed more at the intermediate or advanced folks, but what I'm trying to do in this entire presentation is how do you write your Chef code so that it's understandable by somebody that's coming just right in the door, and they understand how to do software development or system administration or whatever, but they don't necessarily know Chef, or they don't know what is good or bad, right? So if you're advanced, don't go and make sort of the Einstein code, because nobody will be able to read it. And also, if you're just getting into Chef, right, how can you kind of detect what are good patterns? If you're just cracking open some random cookbook, how can you detect if it's good code or if it's bad code, right? So what we tell you in Chef Fundamentals in our class is, so we go through basically the Chef Fundamentals. Hopefully I'm not spoiling this for anyone, but you're basically going through and you're creating a birdhouse, and that birdhouse consists of, how do you automate a web server setup with Chef? And then at the end of the class, we tell you, you're probably not going to want to just create your own Apache cookbook from scratch because there's like a gazillion of them out there, right? Or if you're automating anything really at your company, right? Let's say you need to set up Zookeeper, or you're setting up Java, or whatever it may be, right? The first thing you're going to do is probably go to Google or go to GitHub or whatever and try and find a cookbook that already does that, so you can get some ideas about the quirks about that software, right? So you don't have to like create everything from scratch. So let's say you're on GitHub. So you're going to type in, you're looking for an Apache cookbook, let's say. So you're going to type in, like Apache Chef cookbook, right? So how do you know if this cookbook is any good? Of these like 60 results or whatever is it here, 64 results, right? So actually, I think that judging a cookbook by its cover is actually not a bad thing. So yeah, this is kind of sad, right? What I really like about this picture, by the way, which you maybe can't see because it's very small, but there's a glass of white wine here. Like, not only is it sad enough that you're cooking by yourself with your microwave, like you don't even have a hot plate in your apartment, right? So you've got a microwave, but then you're going to like pour yourself a little glass of wine to go with this microwave meal. Like, oh, it's so sad, right? So some of this code has been anonymized, right? It's not me. It might have been somebody I work with or used to work with, but I'm not going to say. But you might, you're going to go and you'll maybe see a cookbook and you'll be like, great, it's an Apache 2 cookbook. Oh, crap. It's updated 2 years ago. So probably you don't want to use that because chances are it hasn't kept up with the state of things, or they sort of wrote it once, or maybe that was even like their copy of the Apache cookbook from Fundamentals, and they just like, hey, I know how to use Git. I can push to a remote, and then it's up there, and then they never touch it again, right? Right. Or you might click on, like, let's say it looks like it's been touched recently, like within the last 2 years, but maybe you go to the issues and you see, oh my God, there's like all these issues and all these pull requests and stuff like that, and they've just been sort of stale and left alone. So maybe that's something that you don't necessarily want to use if it doesn't look like it's well maintained. Like I said, judging the cookbook by its cover, if you crack it open, and every GitHub project has or should have a readme.md, if you do knife cookbook create, which is the command to create a new cookbook, it'll basically populate the readme.md with some bogus skeleton that looks like this, right? I think it has some other boilerplate these days, right? But if somebody's uploaded their cookbook and it just has the pro forma boilerplate stuff that came with knife cookbook create, chances are that code is maybe not very good, or they didn't finish their job, because like what kind of a developer doesn't document what they're actually doing, right? At least put in like what this cookbook does, what the prerequisites are, what operating systems does it work on, right? So that can maybe give you a little bit of a clue as to whether or not that code is well maintained or not. So what about what the code looks like inside, which is kind of the nut of my presentation, right? So you have this thing, if you're a software developer, you know that this is like what's known as code smell. If you look at some code, you can sometimes detect like whether it smells good or bad, right? So I'm going to talk about some of the patterns that you see in the community cookbooks out there, not just the ops code community cookbooks, but just cookbooks out there that I think are indicative of bad code smell. Things that are, by the way, some of this code is actually ours. So a bit of a mea culpa, right? Just there's a lot of different patterns, and some of the ops code cookbooks honestly have some, a fair amount of technical debt in there that needs to be addressed. And this is an example from the Postgres cookbook, which actually is no longer maintained by ops code. But, folks that sometimes Ruby developers get very wrapped up in being clever with their code, right? So you get this thing, like you read this, and if you're not a Ruby expert, you read this, you're like, what the fuck is this? Right? Like, what the hell is map? Like, and select, what are we even doing here, right? But when I looked at this code, like you sit here, and I'm not a Ruby expert, right? But so I know enough Ruby to be dangerous. But I look at this and I'm like, now I need to know, 4 different functions and figure out what the hell is going on, and what is this even trying to do? What it's trying to do is just to see if you've set the Postgres password, right? So like just testing for, like it's trying to solve some general use case, right? But it's only testing one attribute to see if it's empty, and if it's not empty, it's throwing an error. So what's with all this ceremony about missing adders and set this? Ridiculous, right? It's like it's like what I said in the notes, in the speaker notes, right? It's using a sledgehammer to kill a fly. Other things that you might see that are bad, if you see anybody using chef : application blah blah blah, and you're basically poking at chef internals. Like, this is not a particularly good thing to do. So this is actually, I think this is also from the previous slide. Sometimes you'll also see people messing with internal data structures in Chef, like run context and run state. I mean, in your recipe code, like that should just, those are internal data structures to Chef, and there are many other ways to do it without having to mess around with those structures. You shouldn't even need to know what those are, right? Those are like super advanced things, advanced use cases. Like if you're writing a Doge formatter, you might want to know what those are, but aside from that, probably not. By the way, I did write the Doge formatter to learn about that stuff. Eventually, it'll be in some blog post or training material or whatever. But okay, so things where you're poking at objects of interest that are on the node object, like the run list and the environment. Like, these are not good patterns to use, because like think about this, for example, right? By the way, so I'm going to go through these bad examples, and I'm going to show you how to rectify them, how to write things in a better way. If you have something like this, what happens if you have another environment that you decide you want to add, right? What if you're like, hey, I want a performance testing environment? Then you're actually going to have to go through this recipe code and change all the times you're using these kinds of comparisons, and then do this whole ceremony of like releasing a new version of the cookbook and then promoting it to all your environments and all this stuff, right? I mean, basically the idea in your Chef code is you want to write it once, and it should be applicable across the board to all the different environments without you ever having to touch conditionals like this, right? And all this kind of stuff too, right? Run list recipes include blah blah blah. Like, there's other ways to do that, and I'll show you a better way to do this. Folks that don't understand Chef has two phases. So you basically, there's a compilation phase where you assemble a resource collection, which is, you can just think of it as an array of all the resources that you're going to execute. And then the execute phase, where the resources are actually converged and things are actually applied to the system. So these two are not the same thing, okay? This means this resource will get put in the resource collection no matter what, and will only get executed if this condition evaluates, right? Or what actually it won't execute if foo is true. And this, if you wrap this resource in an if end, this means that it won't even get applied and compiled into the resource collection. So you want to make sure you're choosing the right thing, right? So any bare Ruby that's just sitting out there dangling in space in your recipe, that's all evaluated at the compile phase. And then all the resources are evaluated in the execute phase. So it's super important to understand. Things that are not declarative, when there's already out-of-the-box resources in Chef, right? So you see there's people that do stuff like this, right? I'm going to execute yum install HTTPD, or well, I probably should say yum-y install HTTPD, and then they write some guard where they like parse the RPM database and grep to see if HTTPD is installed. I mean, there's a package resource in Chef for a reason, right? So people not being familiar with what Chef gives you out of the box and then basically treating Chef like a shell scripting language or PowerShell scripting or whatever, right? Just like, that's bad. So you will see cookbooks out there that do this kind of stuff, and you're just like, what were you thinking, right? Another example, like I said in the speaker's notes, right? People using execute resource with curl or wget. There's remote file, right? And remote file can do everything that curl and wget does, and it's more declarative, and it has all the guards built in and all this stuff. So you don't need to use execute for that. Missing guards, again, some of the resources, right, obviously aren't convergent or idempotent by default, right? So if you have execute or batch or PowerShell script or whatever, and you have no guard, it's just going to execute every time. It's going to do that operation every single time, which might not be idempotent, right? It might have side effects to the system. The other thing is that if you execute this every time, it's always going to count as an updated resource in your Chef run, which is maybe not a good thing if you're using the number of resources that are updated for monitoring or metrics or whatever, or an indication about somebody changing the system, et cetera. Not using native Ruby data types when you write your stuff, when you write your recipes. So things like, you know, sometimes you'll crack open somebody's attributes file and they'll be like, oh, the port that I should be listing on is 1433 as a string. Or, you know, some disable enable flag is like the string disabled instead of, you know, the built-in Ruby true and false. Why is this important? Like I said, if you're using native data types, then it allows you to validate whether somebody's actually set the value correctly. If you're just passing strings, how the heck are you supposed to know, right? Somebody sets port to be foo, well, you know, that's just going to get passed straight through. You have really no ability to syntax check that without some crazy regexes or whatever. But if you're actually forcing them to set it as an integer, then you can use things like, I'll show you a little bit later, but there's attributes validation libraries that you can plug into Chef to make sure people are setting sane values, setting correct data types for the things, right? It's basically to avoid errors when you go to, as you're deploying out your Chef code. Fear of LWRPs. LWRPs are basically custom types, custom resources. So I admit I used to fear LWRPs. When I was first learning Chef, I was like, ooh, that sounds really scary, right? It's a 4-letter acronym. But really, it's basically just, you can think of it like a macro almost, right? You're just basically creating a custom resource. And you're in that custom resource, you can be doing things like, hey, setting up a JBoss instance or a Tomcat instance, and just like creating that repeatable package of things to do, and you're just wrapping it in an abstraction, right? I don't have any examples to put here because otherwise the slides would be like through the floor because they're like 200 lines long. But my previous job, as you can see in the speaker's notes, had a Jetty cookbook where it was basically this huge giant loop over a giant attribute array for every Jetty instance. And this is like, why didn't I just write a Jetty instance LWRP? That would be like an abstraction because you have, right? And then inside that has all the crap to do with like setting up your XMLs for your Jetties and all this stuff, and it's all hidden from the user, right? It's a lot easier to manage. People hard coding strings in their cookbook. This is particularly annoying in community cookbooks where, hey, everybody like that works for a startup assumes that you can just connect your systems directly to the internet. And I'll assure you that this is not true for many enterprises out in the world, right, where their servers are in a data center that are locked down. If you're lucky, you can get access to the internet through an HTTP proxy. But most cases, you can't, right? So this is very stupid if somebody hard codes the source for where they're fetching their artifact from, whether this be a gem or a tarball or a zip file or whatever, like hard coding that directly into their recipe without making it a configurable attribute that somebody that needs to operate this thing in a lockdown environment needs to use, right? Access conditions and recipe length. I guess I could click on this. I don't know if it'll work. If this still works. Oh, it's not going to share it, is it? Okay, anyway, if you click on this, or if you open this old version of this server recipe, it's like 200 lines long, and it's like total spaghetti code with all these crazy conditionals and stuff like that for all these different platform handling, like Ubuntu versus Debian versus RHEL versus all this stuff, and it's just like this giant bloatware. Nobody can really understand it, right? So if your recipe is probably, I would say, over, 100 lines or so, 150, somewhere in there, then it's probably too long. That's what I would argue. Okay, so I kind of pointed out maybe some of the bad practices, right? We're also responsible for some of those bad practices. So like I say, nobody's perfect, but the first part of learning about something is like first part of addressing your problem is to recognize that you have a problem. So good cookbooks put that control flow and stuff like that in attributes. Especially for your cross-platform cookbooks. Like if you have a MySQL cookbook that needs to work on 5 different platforms, you put the control flow in your attributes, and then basically your server recipe just goes through and does the thing for all those against all those attributes. So an example would be, I think this is the Postgres cookbook. So this is one thing that the Postgres cookbook does do right, is you have a case up here, right, and then you have when blocks for every operating system or operating system flavor, and then you're setting, I'm sorry it's very small, but basically, in here you're setting, well, what are the packages, what are the client packages on Debian and Ubuntu called? Okay, what are the server packages on Debian and Ubuntu called? Right, what is the service name? There's a default service name, but if some of these platforms call their service name something different, like, SUSE Linux calls it like PGSQL or whatever it is, and, RHEL calls it, well, PostgreSQL. Like you can write all this platform conditional stuff and this branching in your attributes. And then what it does is it makes your recipe code super simple, right? Like to install the server, like all you're doing is just iterating over whatever the package or whatever the platform set the array of server packages to and install the packages, like you're done. That's 3 lines. Okay, so it's really easy for you to support additional platforms, OmniOS, Solaris, AIX, whatever, in this cookbook by simply going into the attributes file and adding another clause for those things. You don't have to change the recipe code anymore. Now, if the things that you do are very different across different platforms, then you should probably separate them out into different recipes for those platforms, right? So you might have, in your cookbook, you might have a default.rb, and it might point to, by default, you're installing the server. And the server recipe would be very simple, and you'd be simply branching based on the platform family or the platform, right? And you put all your implementation specific logic for your individual platforms into these cookbooks, or sorry, into these recipes down here. And you can use this kind of underscore name trickery. That's my convention anyway. You can think of these as like the private recipes, right? That people shouldn't actually invoke them directly. You shouldn't put them in their run list, right? That's kind of a signal to people that you're probably just going to use the server recipe directly. Okay, that's what I was saying, public versus private. Not abusing compile time. This is also super important because, again, like you look at this and you're like, what the fuck, right? What does this even mean? What are we trying to do here? So we're trying to install a bunch of packages at compile time. Like, why are we even doing this, right? Like, this is the wrong syntax to be using, the wrong stuff. Like, there's clearly, like, there's some race condition here, and you're like poking at run context and poking at the run state and this run action thing, and like, again, you look at this and you're like, what is this doing? I have no idea, right? This run action thing, which I don't even want to get into, it shouldn't be there. Like I said, poking chef internals is pretty bad. So if you use, like, remember I showed you that slide that said chef application.fatal. So if you use chef application.fatal, that's an internal chef method call for use by chef itself. And that's usually used by knife. Like if knife blows up, right, it will call chef application fatal, so it'll give you an error message. But if you use that in your recipe, you're just going to get system exit in the stack trace of your chef run, which is not particularly helpful to figure out what the hell happened. So it's better if you raise an exception, like if you have some error condition where you can't proceed, right, use fail or raise, and then that will be carried up by chef through the exception chain. That'll appear in your stack trace. The message will be a lot more clear. And it'll also show up, like I say, in the speaker's notes. If you're using hosted chef or enterprise chef that has the event history, like that message that you put in the fail will actually show up in that log. Often you'll see some cookbooks where they're like, hey, I'm writing a cookbook for MySQL or whatever, and MySQL has like 15,000 knobs that you can tune. So the first thing I'm going to do is create this 15,000 line attribute file for every single knob I'm ever going to be able to tune in MySQL. But I mean, honestly, how often do you touch all those parameters in MySQL, right? I mean, you're probably going to touch like 5% of them in your given life. So don't over parameterize everything, because when you try to read a template and all it is a bunch of like ERB, like equals and all this stuff, right? I mean, it's impossible to figure out. Like, don't over-optimize just because you can.
Can we hold off on the questions till at the end? I just don't want to disrupt the flow of the presentation, unless you're fine with it.
Well, the quick answer is actually, if you have a lot of attributes, like if you have a lot of tunables, then you basically should just architect your recipe to allow the user to pass a hash with key values, and then you just iterate over that, and like MySQL port is your key, and 3306 is your value, and so on and so forth, right? Instead of having individual attributes for all the tunables. Okay. Giving people options for installation. This is sort of related to what I was saying about the hard-coded URLs, right? I mean, think about if you have, like, this is how you might, if you're fooling around with the Fuzolix package on your workstation, maybe that's how you would fool around with it, but this is probably not what you're going to actually do in production, right? So there seem to be a lot of recipes out there that do this kind of stuff in the cookbook. And I mean, this is assuming a lot. This is assuming like your system, your server in your data center has access to pull stuff down from the internet over Git, and that you have the whole M4 and AutoConf toolchain available on your server, and you have a C compiler, and you're gonna like copy this stuff over into user local or whatever would make install, right? And above all, none of this is deterministic, because what if somebody changes, like you patch the system and you get you upgraded libc or libssl or whatever, because libssl gets upgraded like every day, vulnerabilities, right, and shit. So it's not deterministic. So the whole point of Chef is to enforce reproducibility and consistency across your environment. If you're doing this kind of stuff in your production systems, like that is completely like opposite to that, right? That's 180 degrees opposite to that. So give people a way to install from packages, especially if they're already available in your distro, right? I mean, I can't think of the number of times where people have written like Nagios cookbooks or whatever, and they do this kind of song and dance when they're on RHEL, and the Nagios packages are already there. So what's the whole sense in doing this, right? In most cases, you should not ever compile from source. That's what I would argue. But maybe that's controversial. I don't know. Also, who really has a C compiler on their production systems? I know that's controversial too, but I wouldn't want one on there. I don't know, on my production boxes. Generally, Chef is, right, the whole benefit of Chef is that it's declarative. You're declaring a system state. It's not a scripting language, right? Which is why I get irritated when people say, oh, my Chef scripts blah, 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 right? They're not scripts, right? Scripts are imperative. A script is like a set of instructions to execute and how to do them, right? The purpose of Chef being declarative is you're like, what is the system state? And then Chef goes and translates that into like the instructions to actually run on the system. So what I was saying before about the whole execute yum install all thing, right, should be using a package resource. So know the Chef resources that are available to you out of the box, right? There's a lot of stuff that you can already do that's out of the box in Chef. Know where to find other LVRPs, custom resources in other cookbooks, so you can avoid this kind of like, having to resort to batch scripts or PowerShell or execute or whatever. Use the log resource if you can, instead of Chef : log. Because it shows up in the reporting interface as an updated resource. Set yourself a guard against it, though, right? So you could also have it be action nothing and be notified from something when something of interest happens. And also logging at the right level, right? You can specify a log parameter of info, warn, debug as part of the log resource. Right now there's a shortcoming in the log resource that's going to be fixed soon, and that it currently counts as an updated resource all the time, but hopefully in the next release we'll fix that. Okay, how to run system commands safely. I've seen people do stuff like they will use the Ruby system call directly from the recipes. Okay, backticks. We have this thing called shellout, mixlib shellout. And that is a safe way for you to shell out and run commands on the system if you need to use them in a guard or a helper library or whatever it is, right? So what is the whole point of mixlib shellout? Is to deal with all the crazy sub-process handling on different versions of Unix and how to deal with childs that died, but you still need to be reaped and all this like stuff, right? Work around like libc bugs and all this crap on like AIX and that stuff. So we invested a lot of time into writing mixlib shellout so that you don't have to do these things which are not reliable across platforms, right? So basically, shellout has two methods. You got shellout without an exclamation and shellout with an exclamation. And the difference is that, I have it down here. So shellout without the exclamation is just fire and forget. And don't care if it succeeds or fails. Probably not what you want in most situations. Shellout exclamation will raise an exception and fail to run if something bad happens, like if non-zero exit code or enoench or whatever it is. Another reason not to use backticks or system and stuff like that is because they're very difficult to mock when you're testing. And you're all going to test your recipe code, right? So if you're writing chef spec unit tests, if you have your system commands in backticks, there's no way that chef spec can mock that, right? It's going to literally run that code on your laptop, and that's not what you want, right? Because you're just unit testing, right? Okay, so an example of how you might use shellout. So you could actually just type this into chef apply if you wanted to mess around with the shellout. Right? If you've never used chef apply, it's just an easy way for you to write a quick resource or two and see how it works on a system without having to connect to a chef server, without having to run chef client, all that stuff. And -s just takes standard in, so you can just start typing chef code and then end it with Control-D. So, all I'm doing here is, setting command equal to the output of shellout and then running a log resource on the standard out of that to prove that it works. And so you could do all kinds of other trickery to make it really actually more production ready, right? This is being done, as I said before, this is being done at compile time because it's just bare Ruby outside of a resource. If you want to run at execute time, you'd put it in a Ruby block. So I apologize. This is what I was saying about the intermediate and advanced stuff, right? So I apologize if I'm leaving the beginners in the dust, but I'm just hoping that the folks who are a little bit more skilled with the recipes will take my advice and make it so that their recipes are easier to read for beginners. This whole thing that I was talking about before with conditionals around chef environment, or does the run list include foobar baths, whatever. Don't do this, again, because you don't want to have to add environments or stuff to your additional conditions to your recipes if you change environments. Instead, you should use feature flags, right? So you should you really want to think about, does your environment have a certain feature turned on and off, right? So rather than being like, well, you know, I'm going to do something different for the pigsty environment. Instead, we can say the pigsty environment has bacon. And if it has bacon, then we're going to include the bacon default recipe, right? And so now you can just say, you can think of your stuff as being, okay, this environment has bacon, that doesn't, this one does, right? Instead of branching on those environments. The environments are just disposable. Their names are irrelevant to you. Okay, so if you have a lot of repetition, right, that's a candidate for writing a custom type or LBRP. So here you have something that's like a big long list of things to do to set up a JBoss instance, you know, have JBoss listing on a different port with a different server root and all this stuff. So you can collapse this all down into, well, first of all, you write the interface, right? And the interface to the LBRP is just what parameters does it take, what actions does it take, what the default action is. And the other advantage of this is you can validate all these parameters here, right? You can be like, well, I'm going to make sure that the person passes the string. I'm going to make sure that the data sources are a hash. I'm going to make sure that the port is an integer, right? All that kind of stuff. And that way, even if you hand this to a developer who maybe just wants to deploy their Java code and they know nothing about how to set up JBoss, and they don't necessarily need to, because you just handed them a good abstract interface for them to stand up a new JBoss instance. All they need to know is, right, what the name of the instance is, maybe what port number it listens on, what their data sources are, and away you go. And you having put all that validation logic in the previous slide that I showed you ensures that they're not going to screw it up. Helper libraries, so I wrote a blog post about this, which is at that tiny URL. It just goes to that blog URL on the bottom. Basically, if you find yourself writing a lot of ceremonial Ruby to do things like guards and that kind of stuff in your recipe code, hey, maybe it's time to just rip that stuff out and make it a little bit more readable to somebody, right? So, for example, win-friendly path, instead of putting this kind of crap in your recipe every time about substituting the slashes on Windows from one direction to the other, you throw this into a library. And then when you invoke it in your chef recipe, you can just say win-friendly path and hand it a path, right? And if you're running on Windows, it'll make the slashes the right way. And if you're running on Unix, well, it won't do anything, right? It's a lot more readable. Okay, so like I said, keeping your recipes small, I'd say less than 100 lines or so. If their recipe is longer than this, then there's probably indication of you're doing too much in there. So, an example of this out in the community, and I think this has been refactored for exactly this reason, but there was the Nagios cookbook with a server recipe that I would argue was doing too much, right? All right, if I'm using the server recipe, that's great. I'm going to install Nagios. Okay, that's cool. Configure Nagios. Okay, that's cool. And then it did all this junk like poking around databag items for what if you're not using databag items? Right? Like, what if that's not how you set up your config? Then you've lost the benefit of the first two things that were useful to automate, and now you can't use this cookbook at all because it bundled too much functionality into this one recipe, right? So now some of the community helpers to help your recipes read easier and have more syntactic sugar, like Chef Sugar. And so Chef Sugar, for example, has all kinds of helpers like instead of doing comparison on node platform version is 6.1 or whatever, you have helpers that say if Debian Squeezy or if rel 5 or whatever, that kind of stuff. And that's literally what the helper says, and you can just use that directly in your recipe, in your code. So anybody reading that will know immediately what the hell you're talking about. Chef Cutlery has some tools in there as well. Attribute validator, which Clinton Wolf talked about at ChefConf, is remember what I was saying about why you should use the native data types to set your attributes, right? So you can then use something like attribute validator library to make sure that people are passing in not only the right values, right, maybe bounds, but you could also check for types. You can check for whether or not they've even set the things at all, that kind of stuff. And if you don't want to use those libraries directly in your code because that introduces an additional dependency, you can just steal their ideas, right, and just throw them into your own cookbook, for example. Okay, so I know that was a lot of material. So just to wrap up, I did not mention testing at all in this talk, right? That's a whole other topic. It's a whole other talk. That's probably actually a whole 2-day class on doing unit testing and integration testing. When will I run that one? When we write the curriculum for it. We will make a class for it though. I'm not mentioning testing at all in this talk. I'm just assuming that eventually either you are testing your cookbook code or eventually you will test your cookbook code. Because think about this, right? Software developers test their code because they want to avoid errors, right? But if you are a software developer, you take down that one application if you screw something up. This is infrastructure code, right? So you have the possibility of like destroying your entire environment if you screw it up. So it's even more important for you to test this code. Actually, did anybody see that? Anybody know that Emory University incident from last week, where they used SCCM to nuke every single Windows machine across the entire campus, including the SCCM server that they installed Windows 7 on the server, so that, like, that's what I tweeted. I said, it takes, if you want to fuck things up, you need a sysadmin. If you want to really fuck things up, you need automation. So that's why you should test your code. Okay, that's a whole other talk, and including good and bad things to test. But the TLDR basically is if you're testing today, the tools that you should be using. For unit testing, use Chef spec. For integration testing, use server spec. And then Test Kitchen ties that all together for you. Okay, so, sum up about the talk generally. Keep your recipes small. Keep them simple and understandable. Use a consistent style. I don't care what it is. I have my own style guide. You should establish your own, but there's nothing worse than somebody walking into a company that has 25 different styles, right? Some people are using symbols, some are using strings, some people are, it's just like, forget it, right? Just figure out what your company's style is. And then also use Food Critic to check for correctness, right? And the Food Critic is more than just a pedantic syntax checker. It actually will help you avoid errors, like you spelled an attribute wrong in your recipe, in your resource, right? It will catch stuff like that. I don't recognize this parameter, right? If you're an expert, if you're an intermediate to advanced chef user, it's very easy for you to write a whole bunch of, you're like, wow, I've got the full power of Ruby available to me. I'm going to write all this crazy stuff, right? Like the chef, that map and select thing that I talked about. You have to be aware of the expert bias, that not everybody in the community is an expert, right? So there's a story, actually. The story that I linked in I usually speak about this, but since it's showing up in the speaker notes, basically, the story is, let's say you're working at the DMV. Okay, so the first day of the DMV, somebody comes and says, I need to renew, I need to register my trailer or whatever it is, right? I need to get a license for my trailer. So you're like, and they're like, I don't know what form to fill out. And so you're like, oh, no problem. You look it up on your computer and you give them the form and they're on their merry way, right? Now it's the 10,000th day you've been working at the DMV or whatever, and somebody comes and is like, I need to register my trailer, and you're like, you fucking idiot! How could you not know that it's form IT-301 that you're supposed to fill out, right? So you got to be aware of that bias if you're an intermediate or advanced chef user, that you're not writing code and you're not treating other users that aren't necessarily as skilled yet with Chef like they're idiots. So make it so that your code is understandable by everyone. Okay, try not to be overly clever with stuff. Just like, I used to have somebody, a Unix admin that I worked with, that would basically do like all of the system administration with one giant sed awk, like 15 pipes or whatever, and you're like, and he's just like, here's a shell script that'll do this thing, and I was like, I don't even know what half these commands are. Jot? What does that do? Okay, so everything that I told you, almost everything that I told you in here, is cribbed from how software developers keep sane in the world, right? This stuff about abstraction and information hiding and layering and all those patterns are really about, hey, if you have everything just out there in the wild, it's impossible for somebody cognitively to understand all that stuff, right? Which is why humans need abstraction. So this is all stolen from software developers. Surprise, ops people can learn from developers too, right? So maybe we should call it ops dev. I don't know. That's controversial too. Okay, so for the folks that don't know Chef yet, we're running a Chef Fundamentals class here in Boston. So we are currently here, and the class is up here, 75 Federal Street, and it's on the 16th and 17th of June. And if you are interested, or if you know your coworkers are interested, There's a code Meetup. When you use to register, you get 10% off. And that's it. Thanks very much. I'll take questions.
I'll just because I have the mic. You didn't mention anything about definitions. What's your opinion on them? Is Chef going to deprecate those at some point, or you just not recommend them because LRPs are just a lot better?
Pretty much, yeah. Because you can't notify a definition. Right, definitions can notify other resources, but you can't notify a definition. That's, yeah.
I was at a decision point. My name is Ian. Two of the examples you mentioned within the last week, basically, I hit that. And one of them was I was pairing with someone, and we were trying to decide how to be able to search for a particular node. And one of the ideas on the table, I won't say whose idea was, but one of the ideas on the table was, oh, we can search for this particular role in the node's run list. And so the other one of us said, well, it's a very high level bit of infrastructure automation that could change at any time. So why don't we try using an attribute? And so what we did was we basically said, we added an isServer attribute, set it to true, and we use that. So is that kind of in harmony with what you were saying?
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's an option. Or even if you do want to search on a role, then you can make the name of the role an attribute as well, right?
Right.
In your search code, so that later on, if you decide you want to rename it, then you just need to change the attribute, and the code looks the same.
Okay. So I actually do have a question, though.
Okay.
So the second one, which went along with it, was went right out of my head. You know what? Come back to me. I'll remember it.
Well, I just wanted to say there, though, that it's also assuming that you're using roles, right? So if it's a community cookbook, someone may not want to use roles. So that's something to think about.
So I'm really new to Chef, or haven't really used it that long, and you keep mentioning guards. I was just wondering, could you just expand on what they are, or what you're meaning by guards?
Sure.
That's not too pedantic.
So a resource in Chef, you can kind of think of it as a test. You can think of Chef as a test and repair system, right? So if you have package, for example, a package declaration, the first thing Chef is going to do is, do I have that package already installed? Yes or no? And if I do, I'm just going to skip this resource. So certain resources, like if you're running scripts like execute or PowerShell or whatever, Chef has no way inherently to figure out whether or not it should do that, right? Because there's no built-in way for it to test. So you have to, what the not if or only if syntax is for you to define what that test operation should be.
I'll bring it over. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So you talked about code reuse briefly, where you pulled a helper method out into a helper class in a library within a cookbook. If you want to reuse code, the same bit of code between multiple cookbooks, do you recommend, is there a clear recommendation between doing that in some kind of base cookbook that everybody uses already anyway, versus, I guess, just publishing a gem somehow? Are there other options? What are the trade-offs?
Yeah, another option. So publishing a gem is a possibility, and attribute validator is part gem, part cookbook. The disadvantage of the gem method is just, now you need to have a gem, now you need to have a gem source that you can pull from, right? And again, if you're behind a firewall, it doesn't have internet access, or now you're in the situation of having to set up like Artifactory or whatever and put the gem up there, and then you have like a whole other release process for that gem. So that, so another method you can use is you can write cookbooks that are pure libraries, don't contain any recipes at all, and all they have is helper methods in them, right?
And just manage those, and that's not some anti-pattern that you wouldn't put that in the bad practice list, or okay.
No, there's lots of folks in the community that have sort of so some like the Poise stuff that Noah Kantrowitz is working on, like that's all pure. Those are just pure library cookbooks, and there's just syntactic sugar, stuff like that. Yep.
Maybe not a very general question, but imagine you had an environment that had been built pre-Chef, and you want to now migrate that over to a chef-driven and compliant system, which we have as a problem in one of the scenarios that we're trying to deliver. Is there any best practices way how you automatically create and accessorize an environment based on facts that you find with some sort of other method? To basically, because we have the problem that we obviously, when we want to rerun the chef client, we want to apply the same configuration again. So when we discover stuff from a pre-chef state, we need to sort of feed that back into the environment. Is there some best practices you can advise?
Not really. There's no, like, any kind of, people have tried this before, not only with Chef, right? People have tried this in the Puppet community and stuff like that, and it doesn't work that well, because it's very difficult for you to define like the complete system state wholly when you haven't built it using some,
I'm not concerned finding it. We know what we're looking for, but the question is, from a methodology perspective, that is a fine practice to do in Chef, basically to automatically create the environment.
I think probably what I would recommend is having a way that you can build a throwaway cluster or environment where you can, you write the chef recipes to get to the state you think it's supposed to be, and then you inspect that system and maybe even write some tests. You write some automated tests, some acceptance tests against this sort of throwaway environment. And then you use, and once you're satisfied with that throwaway environment, then you can confidently apply that code you've written to your existing brownfield. Yeah.
So the previous example I was talking about was that we were basically doing a Cassandra deployment on CloudFormation using Cassandra Community Cookbook, but with an org wrapper cookbook. And so the other thing we realized we were trying to deploy an Ops Center monitoring server with that cluster is that it needed this cluster definition file, and it had its own specific format. What we discovered was, we could actually just create an attribute hash for everything Ops Center, and then just use the chef file resource to iterate through that hash and just write it out in its own format. And it's very, very clever, but for me, being probably on the lower end of experience, I said, someone coming in might be really confused by this. Might it be better if we just use a template? And it wouldn't be a huge template, and there's only a few, parameters there. So, from your perspective, would it be better from an overall perspective, community-wise, to use a template, even though it's maybe not as clever and clean as, doing that hash Ruby magic?
I think it depends on who your audience is, right? Know your audience. So you can be as clever as you want if that cookbook is never going to make it outside your company, and everybody's sort of at that level, or maybe just below the cleverness level at which you are. But if you hope to kind of, you're like, all right, this is how we do Cassandra. I don't know these products, right, Ops Center or whatever, but let's say you were to contribute this to the community. If you got to know that people out in the community are looking for a cookbook to do this. Maybe a lot of them aren't going to know what you're doing. So you got to kind of gauge that appropriately. Other questions? Yeah.
So the first time when I looked at Chef was some time ago, I was wondering if you see something like a Dublin core of a namespace emerging for proper attribute naming.
Yeah, interesting. Are you talking? Well, okay. So in terms of cookbook namespacing on the community site, or are you talking about namespacing of libraries, or?
Just the attribute of a cookbook, for example, would be nice, right? If we had a common name, you could snip certain attributes of other environmental areas which define an area. Let's say you have a database and you want to snip the original database name, and you want to rely on certain kind of naming. At the moment, you really have a human has to look in and do some mapping to make it work. There's no attempt to standardization that I can recognize, and no namespace declaration to what namespace definition you would define the attribute ontologies or whatever that might be related.
Yeah, there's not any standard. I doubt there. I mean, I think what the community is centered around is name the top level of your attributes after your cookbook in most situations. And then after that, it's up to your definition. But Chef is one of those. So the philosophy of Chef is like there's more than one way to do it, and it's a very flexible tool. So we're very. I would say the community is loath to be like this is the only way that you write stuff, and that's sort of if you've come from a Puppet background, like Puppet is very much, like for better or for worse, right? Puppet is very, you will fit into this DSL and you will only do things our way. So there's sort of pros and cons to that.
It makes automatic consumption of the class of providers of database. But you really have to look at each instance file.
Well, how do you mean?
You need to know how to parameterize a database working with your application server or whatever. At the moment, you really need to look at the very concrete cookbook to understand what the attribute names are, to find out how the cookbook works. There's no way that you have a namespace defining that for database cookbooks in general as a class.
No.
Very similar.
No, not really. But generally your cookbook would be named after the product that you're trying to automate, right? So yeah, you're right. Like the MySQL and Postgres cookbooks or SQL Server don't roll up to some class of database cookbooks. You're right. But their attributes are generally going to be like the MySQL cookbook's attributes are going to be named MySQL and then whatever.
If you want to map down the system ontology, like say network with VLANs and bridges and bonding, and you have a certain requirement of knowledge of an environment, at the moment there's no way to express it in a way that all cookbooks can benefit from that. Right? Everybody can make up their own way to put that down in an attribute.
Sure. Yes.
Right.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
If you work with the chef cookbook managers like Berks, for example, and you would like to extend Berks or override some of the default cookbook parameters, do you actually recommend to create your own cookbook and kind of override the original cookbook parameter, basically instead of forking the original cookbook?
Are you asking about wrapper cookbooks? Is that what you're asking about?
Yep.
When to use wrapper cookbooks and that kind of stuff? Yeah, I would say generally if you're getting something from the community, you try to use a wrapper cookbook to change its values and stuff like that. I have a blog post about how to do that correctly. There's a lot of people that there's stuff I didn't cover in this deck, but there's a lot of folks, using incorrect attribute precedence levels and all this bastardization of wrapper cookbooks. So I have a post on the Chef blog about how to do wrapper cookbooks correctly.
Okay.
What else can I answer? Yeah.
So I guess one of the things is if you're just starting off as an organization and you're either moving towards Chef or you're trying to adopt Chef, is it something that you would coordinate? Like we can reach out to Chef to basically work together to figure out how to bootstrap our environment and do these things correctly, and basically get off on the right foot to start, because it's quick. You can quickly go down the path and end up with a giant rat's nest of poorly architected Chef code. And
yes.
So yeah, I guess maybe if you want to speak to a little bit of how that generally works out.
Sure, I can talk about a couple of touch points. So one of the touch points is where we realized that, so we have learnchef.com, and what we're trying to do is improve that material a lot to walk through common use cases that people might see, right? So the advantage of the fundamentals training as it is, as I mentioned before, like what do you actually do in that fundamentals training is you're setting up an Apache web server and how to deploy it and all that stuff, because everybody's done that before in their careers, right? Even if you're a developer, never touched a system before as a sysadmin, like you know what Apache is. And same thing with the Windows training is you have like the fundamentals takes you through setting up IIS, because everybody's kind of done that before, right? So we're trying to make the learnchef.com a little bit more scenario-based from that perspective, and the learning, you basically have a journey, if you will, as your learning chef to go through that. And then sort of more on the product side, what we're trying to do is, like, we see ourselves as, I think we're successful and customers are the most successful when we're kind of their coach, right? Like, you're learning chef, you're writing the code because you know your infrastructure, you know what's important to you. But yeah, we have some, we're the folks that are like keeping you on the straight and narrow and making sure you don't like totally drive off the road with this new fancy car that you bought, right? So one of the initiatives that we're trying out is this thing called Chef's Table. And actually, Mike or Noah, either of you guys can talk about that, or? Okay, it's basically, I think it's like $99 a month. Is that right? And basically we'll send you a bunch of shirts and stickers and all that stuff. But really, what you care about is having somebody you can call to be like, "Am I on the right track? Can you review my recipe code, right, for an hour or two or whatever, just sort of ad hoc? And am I doing the right thing? Am I structuring my cookbooks correctly? Am I going down sort of the right direction?" So. If that's something you're interested in as you're getting started with Chef, go speak to Mike Tyler, who's in the green shirt at the back. He works for Chef. He's our solutions architect for this area, and we can definitely talk more about that. Yep. I'm here all night, folks. Don't forget to tip your waitress.
So my Windows architect just recently came back from Tech Ed. He was really excited about all the stuff that Microsoft was announcing. He threw out acronyms like DSC or something like that. And I'm just wondering, how does that work with Chef? Because it sounds like what Microsoft is doing is basically scriptifying ways of scriptifying how you install Microsoft Windows products on a consistent basis. And it sounds a lot like Chef, but I usually use it on the Linux side. I'm not a big Windows person, but I'm just trying to figure out how do those two different environments, how will they marry or merge?
Right. I'm glad you asked, because I was at Tech Ed last week, and so I was doing the PowerShell and DSC presentation. So who's on a Windows environment here? Who would be automating Windows? Be interested in automating Windows? So mind if I take another 5 minutes, and I'll put something else up, actually.
Yeah.
So let me kill this. I think I did this one in PowerPoint. So the newer versions of PowerShell have this thing called DSC, desired state configuration, which is very similar to it's a declarative way to manage your systems with PowerShell, I should say. So you basically, what it does is you're writing PowerShell modules, and they get compiled to an intermediate format called the MOF, and then you have a thing on a Windows box called the LCM, Local Configuration Manager, that takes this compiled MOF and applies it to the system. So the principles are basically the same. So what we're trying to do at Chef is integrate really tightly with this way of doing things. Because like a lot of folks are like, well, should I just use DSC? Like, didn't Microsoft basically steal Chef or Puppet or whatever, or CF Engine, and make it their own? The concepts are the same, but at the same time, like, what are the benefits of Chef? Cross-platform, right? The syntax is out there. It's a lot easier to understand. It's been around a lot longer, right? There's already folks that are out there managing a lot of infrastructure with Chef, and really what DSC is good for the automation community generally, because honestly, if you try to automate Windows, like the biggest barrier to automating Windows for me is like the fact that you have all these commercial off-the-shelf software vendors that give you like an MSI that doesn't really work. You can't install it unattended, or they expect you to go and muck around with a bunch of INI files or registry settings and all this crap, right? So the fact that Microsoft is bringing this to the table to bear, really it's about beating those software vendors over the head to make it so that they are shipping DSC hooks for you to be able to automate your Windows systems, right? So it's good for everyone. It's good for the entire ecosystem. So basically what we're trying to do, let me just skip forward here, because you know all this. What we're doing is we're going to transparently map DSC resources into Chef so that you can invoke DSC directly from your Chef recipes. Yes, sir. Yeah, so DSC only works on, I believe, 2008 R2 or better. Yeah. So WMF4 works on that version and up, and WMF5 currently is in preview, and it only works on 2012 R2, but they might backport it to 2012 at least. So the idea is if you know DSC, or you've seen the syntax, right? DSC has a similar kinds of things with resources and has the resources sit in modules, which you can kind of think of as cookbooks as well. So we're going to ship this feature called, the DSC, a DSC library that basically allows you to map one-to-one between the Windows DSC resources and Chef. And the advantage of this is that you could do something like you could totally mix and match your DSC resources and your non-DSC resources, because like some of these things, some of the libraries in DSC to set up IIS pools and apps and stuff like that aren't quite mature. They're all like X, the prefix with an X, which means that they're experimental. So sometimes they break and they blow up in spectacular ways. So if you don't trust them, you can use sort of the native ways in Chef of setting that stuff up, but it gives you the full power of DSC. So that's generally the idea. And yeah, that's it. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Anybody else? All right. Thanks a lot, Julian.
Sure.